Good day, I'm Henry, an assistant professor at School of Life Science and SU Banner Neurodegenerative Disease Research Center at Arizona State University. I was a Duke-UNC ADRC Rec Scholar between 2022 and 2023. It's my pleasure to give an introduction on the very special tau protein that is involved in several different notorious neurodegenerative disorders, including Alzheimer's disease. The title of this video is Untangle the Mystery of Tau. So here's an outline of what I will cover in this video. First, I will give a brief background introduction of Alzheimer's disease. Next, I will talk about a protein called tau, which forms one of the two hallmark pathologies observed in Alzheimer's disease patients. Then I will introduce the physiological functions of tau in the brain, discuss some of the emerging concepts of tau, and switch our gears to what happens to tau in disease by focusing on the role of tau modifications. And lastly, I will talk about current status in research for potential tau targeting therapies for AD and wrap up with the conclusions. Alzheimer's disease was first described by a German psychiatrist, Alois Alzheimer, in 1906. As we all know, after more than a century, now Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia. You can see the pie chart below. Alzheimer's disease occupies more than half of the total cases of dementia. In terms of numbers, it's 37 million people worldwide now living with Alzheimer's disease, and the number keeps increasing as people now live much longer than 100 years ago. And moreover, Alzheimer's disease not only affects memory and cognition, it is also fatal. From the CDC's data, it's currently the 7th leading cause of death in the United States in 2021. This gigantic number of cases actually cause some consequence, not only biologically, but also economically. For example, in 2022, the total cost on AD in the US is $321 billion. And this number is expected to be 1 trillion by 2050. More importantly, it is the only disease in the top 10 causes of death that without a way to prevent, cure, or even slow down. Let me give you an example about another top 10 cause of this death, COVID. So COVID-19 came out about 4 years ago. It causes a lot of trouble and killed a lot of people. However, now we already have multiple different vaccines and medicines to prevent and even cure it. Unfortunately, Alzheimer's disease is not like that. Current treatments for Alzheimer's disease still only alleviate symptoms, but do not stop or slow down pathogenesis. The good news is that, in the past few years, there have been some immunotherapies approved by FDA for a small subset of patients. But scientists definitely still have a lot to do. Alzheimer's disease research could be very important and impactful, as if we could delay Alzheimer's disease by 5 years, the number of individuals with Alzheimer's could be decreased by as much as 50% over time. Therefore, there's an urgent need for development of early diagnosis and more efficient intervention strategies. One of the primary reasons to make Alzheimer's therapy so difficult is that Alzheimer's disease is predominantly sporadic. Even though family history still somehow gives you a higher prevalence to get Alzheimer's disease, there are only less than 1% of the Alzheimer's cases caused by deterministic genes. So far, the scientists have identified some risk factors and some protective factors for Alzheimer's disease. Here, I want to highlight a few of them. Aging is the one primary risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, as the number of people with Alzheimer's disease doubles every 5 years beyond age of 65. And next, Alzheimer's disease is almost twice as common in women compared to men. Therefore, the sex difference is always a hot topic in the field that people try to understand. After aging and sex, ApoE is the most relevant genetic risk factor currently known for Alzheimer's disease. Of course, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, those are very common chronic disorders for elderly, and they are also critical risk factors. On the other hand, even though there's no cure for Alzheimer's, you can still do several activities to reduce the prevalence getting the disease, such as regular physical and cognitive activities. Biologically, Alzheimer's disease is characterized by neuronal loss and atrophy as shown in the figure of healthy and AD brains on the left. If we do histology staining on AD brains, we can find two hallmark pathological features, amyloid plaques and tau tangles. It is unclear still how A beta and tau interplay to lead to the disease, as the mechanism is very complex and probably multifactorial. But fortunately, recent research evidence strongly suggests that the relationship between A beta and tau in disease could be like trigger and bullet. A beta is likely to initiate the pathogenesis, but tau is potentially the toxic species that kill neurons. As a result, from now on, we will focus on the tau protein in the video. And in fact, tau pathology is not only seen in Alzheimer's disease, but more than 20 other distinct clinical presentations. Some common ones include ALS, Parkinson's, corticobasal degeneration, frontotemporal dementia, Pick's disease, and PSP. Therefore, studying tau not only helps us understand Alzheimer's disease, but also in general, neurodegeneration and dementia. So what is tau? Tau was first identified in 1975. Its name actually comes from the acronym of Tubulin Associated Unit, which tells you that tau is a microtubule-associated protein. And tau is only expressed in the central nervous system by alternative splicing of the MAPT gene. It is also one of the most abundant proteins in the brain, and there are 6 different isoforms of tau. 3 of them have 3 repeat domains, and the other 3 have 4 repeat domains. Historically, scientists think tau's primary function is to stabilize neuronal microtubule. You can imagine microtubules are like North Carolina state highways I-40 or I-85 that are responsible for important substance, proteins, and organelle transport in cells. Microtubule is even more important for neurons because of their very specialized morphology. And like other maps, normally tau binds to and stabilizes microtubule in the axons of neurons. However, when the environment changes, such as an age-related perturbation hits, tau will fall off microtubules. And the consequence of that are, first, in the absence of tau binding, microtubule will fall apart and all the intracellular transport will be disrupted. You can imagine, if I-40 is collapsed, it's gonna be a nightmare for the North Carolina Research Triangle area. And secondly, those free-floating tau will aggregate and form tangles as a hallmark in AD brains, as I showed previously. However, as I mentioned, tau is one of the most abundant proteins in the brain, so it's kind of hard to believe microtubule stabilizer is the only role that tau plays in the brain. So what else does tau do has always been an unanswered question in the field. Unfortunately, as the research going on, the past few years, there have been some emerging concepts about the non-traditional roles of tau, and I will talk about some of them. So first, tau is believed to facilitate axonal transport, and this one is somehow intuitive as we know tau regulates microtubule structure, and microtubule is responsible for the transport in neurons. But briefly, by a series of signaling pathways between tau and multiple proteins, including protein phosphatase 1 and GSK3 beta, tau is able to regulate a motor protein called kinesin to release organelles in specific areas of the neurons. However, when tau is abnormally modified or oligomerized, which are p-tau and o-tau in the upper panel, this homeostatic process may be interrupted and cause issue to neurons. In addition to axonal transport, tau is likely to regulate several synaptic pathways in both pre- and post-synaptic compartments. At a presynaptic compartment, tau undergoes phosphorylation at a phosphorylation epitope called ATA. This event increases calcium release from intracellular space, and reduces neurotransmitter release in a IP3 dependent manner. Also, pathological forms of tau reportedly restrict vesicle mobility through scaffold interaction with the vesicular proteins. When tau localizes an essential kinase fin to the postsynapse, which allows fin to phosphorylate an NMDA receptor and leads to NMDA receptor stabilization via interaction with a postsynaptic protein called PSD95. Again, in disease, abnormally modified tau can affect tau and fin binding and ultimately lead to impaired synaptic activity by trapping of fin in the synapse in specifically dendritic spines. And next, I want to briefly talk about tau is potentially involved in insulin and neurotrophic factor pathways. Neurotrophic factors and insulin activate specific receptor tyrosine kinase, and some of the downstream targets, such as P10 and SHP2, are believed at least partially modulated by tau. So here I wanted to highlight the tau-P10 interaction because P10, this protein plays an important role in the classic mTOR pathway. And nowadays, inhibition of mTOR pathway has been considered a way to delay aging and increase longevity. And currently, there are multiple candidates in clinical trials. So for all the traditional and emerging functions of tau, you probably noticed that all of them primarily relies on tau's modification status. Indeed, modifications, or we call PTMs on tau, are essential determinants for tau. If we draw all potential tau PTM sites on a piece of paper, we'll get that tau PTM is super complex as we see here on this slide. There are hundreds of sites on tau can undergo different types of PTMs, including phosphorylation, acetylation, among others. We all know that tau hyperphosphorylation is a signature for AD. However, tau is already phosphorylated on certain residues in health. When healthy, these PTMs are critical to maintain its function, as I have just mentioned. Therefore, it is important to understand how tau PTM evolves in health and in disease, and understand its implication. And among all tau PTMs, here I want to highlight a relatively novel modification that is directly linked to disease progression. It is tau acetylation. So tau acetylation was identified about a decade ago, and it only shows up in diseased brains but not controlled normal brains. And recent evidence suggests that acetylation could be the prime PTM for tau. And in other words, if we prevent tau acetylation, we could potentially prevent other pathological modifications on tau. And indeed, modulation of tau PTMs have been emerged as one of the promising strategies for Alzheimer's therapy, as we see here in the dashed rectangle in this figure from a review on tau targeting therapy. And among all the PTM-related targets, regulation of tau acetylation is rare and has a high potential because of all the failure from the tau phosphorylation targeted trials. And obviously, there are two ways to prevent or reverse tau acetylation. One is to inhibit acetyltransferase, and the other one is to promote deacetylase. In some research groups, they already tested acetyltransferase inhibitors in animals and saw promising results. On the other hand, several research groups are trying to increase the level of particular deacetylases to reduce tau acetylation. And most of these studies are still ongoing, but I look forward to the progress very soon, look forward to see the results. Therefore, in conclusion, in this video, I hope you learned that Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia, and currently there's no cure. The neurofibrillary tangles that composes of tau is observed in various neurological disorders, including Alzheimer's disease. And tau has been recognized as a microtubule stabilizer. However, there have been other roles of tau emerged in recent years. And tau function in pathology is primarily mediated by its PTM status. So therefore, PTM regulation could be the key for therapeutic developments. And among all the PTMs, tau acylation has been emerged as one of the potential druggable targets. And with that, thank you very much for your attention and feel free to email me with any questions. Thank you for listening.